Monolith's F.E.A.R, released in 2005, really took the FPS genre in an interesting direction when it combined insane, over-the-top Hollywood movie-style firefights with an engaging paranormal theme and story. And Perseus Mandate, F.E.A.R's second expansion, doesn't deviate very much at all from the formula that made F.E.A.R such a fantastic game. Indeed, Perseus Mandate tries, often with success, to improve and refine the formula set out by F.E.A.R, but that's not to say that the game is not without more than a few flaws. Perseus Mandate tells the story of a second F.E.A.R team dispatched to a second ATC facility. As well as having to deal with ATC and replica forces, there's also a third enemy faction involved in the game, a mercenary force known as Nightcrawlers. This faction is after the Source, which is Alma's DNA, which can presumably be used to create more psychic commanders like F.E.A.R or another clone army. The game doesn't really tread new ground in terms of story or storytelling. In fact, the core bulk of the story can be summed up with one sentence: you have to get to the Source before the Nightcrawlers do. That's pretty much the story. Everything else in the game is just a reiteration of F.E.A.R's story and themes, but the story itself can actually be considered completely moot, as Monolith does not consider Perseus Mandate or the previous expansion Extraction Point a part of the F.E.A.R canon. Effectively, the story didn't ever actually happen. The game's biggest problem is that it has a split personality. It's a second expansion pack, and the game is considerably harder than either F.E.A.R or Extraction Point, but it's also a standalone expansion pack, meaning it's been developed to try to appeal, at least in part, to people who've never played a F.E.A.R game before. These two concepts are mutually exclusive and simply cannot exist in the same game, and it completely ruins the flow. The game opens with a slow and steady tutorial section throwing only a few enemies at you at a time, but almost as soon as you're finished with your training wheels, the game is throwing the Nightcrawlers at you with their extremely powerful advanced rifle that would feel more appropriate towards the end of the game. The awkward pacing continues for the first 90 minutes or so as the game throws poor mixes of enemies at you and at badly timed intervals, never really managing to tease the play with morsels before throwing a main course at us like F.E.A.R did. This poor pacing is compounded by very constricting level design, which is a real shame after the large open areas found in Extraction Point that really showcased the power of the AI. After all, what good is a flanking AI in a corridor? To make matters worse, there's almost a complete absence of storytelling, and the game is mostly throwing Nightcrawlers at you who simply aren't anywhere near as cool looking or sounding as the replicas, and their steeper difficulty level makes them generally less fun to fight. But just around the time where most people might start to think that Perseus Mandate is simply not worth finishing, around 2 hours in, there's a pretty great set piece involving a new and much more formidable version of the Eve seen in F.E.A.R. This sequence acts as a breakwater between good and bad, and it feels almost as if an entirely different team worked on the second half of the game. From that point on, everything in Perseus Mandate just pops and comes together wonderfully. The areas open up, the game starts to throw more enemies at you and throws better combinations of enemies at you, including more replica soldiers. The health and reflex boosters you've been picking up more or less at this point help you catch up with the difficulty level, and the shift towards the paranormal and the ramped up storytelling makes the game far more engaging. Perhaps the most significant way that Perseus Mandate differs from F.E.A.R is that there's very little horror, at least in the first 2/3 of the game. There are only a few scares, and Alma and F.E.A.R are only alluded to on a few occasions. But the further into the game you go, the more the game starts to shift into a horror game. This works well as both a storytelling and tension building device, but it also helps make the latter stages of the game, which are already the best parts of Perseus Mandate, even better. The final third of Perseus Mandate actually features some of the best level design and some of the most intense firefights seen in a F.E.A.R game to date, and one particular surreal vision sequence is by far the best scene in the entire F.E.A.R series. And it's also one of the major cues that establishes Perseus Mandate's shift toward the paranormal, making it even more prominent. Although Perseus Mandate is nothing new to F.E.A.R fans, there are a few new enemy types and 3 new weapons, but none of these new additions can really be considered actually new. The grenade launcher, while satisfying to use, is simply a far more cumbersome and less precise means of throwing grenades at your enemies, which also uses up a whole item slot. The advanced rifle combines the stopping power and rate of fire of the G2A2 assault rifle, which was one of the mainstay weapons in F.E.A.R, with the scope function of the ASP rifle, while the lightning arc gun is simply a rehashed version of, and tragically a replacement for, the particle beam weapon seen in F.E.A.R, which is now absent. Although the lightning arc gun is powerful, there are very few instances of it in the game, and it isn't first seen until close to the end of the game, so you won't actually have much opportunity to use it. Its appearance is also strangely phallic, so you might not actually want to use it anyway. With the exception of the particle beam gun, Extraction Point's whole arsenal returns, but some weapons like the laser gun are found so rarely as to be considered little more than an occasional tasty treat. The stealth ninjas of the original F.E.A.R make only a cameo appearance in the game, as does the Eve, which is a shame as these two enemies really mixed things up and forced players to adapt their style of play in the game environment. F.E.A.R's combat model is so fantastic that these omissions aren't a great loss, but there's no good reason for these enemies to be mostly absent, and the scarcity of some weapons is simply annoying. The new enemies are also nothing new really. There's a particular supernatural horror that lives in shadows that will pull you down and start mauling you if you get too close to its shadow, but these shadows are easy to spot and avoid, so you probably won't get much of a hard time from them. The Nightcrawlers are new in the same way that a clip episode of a television program is new. Although they have a new skin and voice, that voice sounds like it belongs in a porn film, by the way. The AI is an only slightly modified version of the replica soldiers. Some of the more elite Nightcrawlers have access to your slow motion ability too, which essentially amounts to them sidestepping really fast. But they can jump much higher than the replicas, and they can jump around on walls and things, meaning they can traverse the environment quickly and pose a greater threat, making them harder to fight. The game is a visual mixed bag. There are areas that look bland and washed out with no shadows or lighting effects and boring, overly used textures, but there are also areas where F.E.A.R has simply never looked better. Although the engine is clearly aged now and looks all the worse as the much better sequel isn't far off, Perseus Mandate is more than good looking enough for the most part, and F.E.A.R fans should certainly be able to overlook any visual shortcomings. The voice acting of the Nightcrawlers and a few support characters notwithstanding, Perseus Mandate has excellent sound, but this is no doubt because it's almost all recycled from F.E.A.R. From the excellent music, which is as used as well as ever as a cue for combat sequences, to the rattle of shell casings as they land, Perseus Mandate sounds every bit as great as F.E.A.R did. Perseus Mandate is like a modern day Final Doom. It's much harder than previous F.E.A.R games. It's certainly showing its age, and some might feel that it's simply outstayed its welcome. But despite a rocky start, some annoying additions and some tragic omissions, Perseus Mandate is, for fans of F.E.A.R, definitely a game to play.